It was a day that began like any other in Harlem, but by nightfall, it would be remembered as the day Bumpy Johnson took down the Mafia. The kind of day that would go down in history, when the Underworld's most powerful criminal kingpin was brought to his knees by his own arrogance, and the streets would never be the same again. It wasn't supposed to happen like this. The Mafia had been comfortable, secure in their grip over the streets of Harlem for years. But the decision to challenge Bumpy Johnson, a man who had built his empire with blood, sweat, and street smarts, would prove to be their greatest mistake. What the Mafia didn't understand was that Bumpy didn't just run Harlem, he was Harlem. And when you try to take the throne from a king, there's only one way it ends. It all started in a smoky, dimly lit back room of a nightclub, where whispers of betrayal spread like wildfire. Bumpy had learned that the Mafia, in their desperation to expand their territory, had started moving into his turf, encroaching on the numbers rackets, trying to push Bumpy out of the very streets he had bled for. They thought they could outsmart him, overtake him in his own kingdom. But they didn't know Bumpy, and they didn't know Harlem. Why is this happening? Bumpy's voice was calm, but full of venom. He sat at a table surrounded by his most trusted men, the few who had stuck with him through thick and thin. His reputation was built on loyalty and respect. But now even some of his closest allies were questioning his ability to maintain control. The Mafia had made their move, and Bumpy was feeling the weight of the challenge pressing in from all sides. His right-hand man, a burly enforcer named Tony, leaned in. They think they can take over, Bumpy. They think they can just walk in and push you out of your own territory. But I've heard things. Rumors about a deal they're making with some heavy hitters. Bumpy's eyes narrowed. He had always known that the Mafia was a threat, but now they were making a direct play against him. You know what we do to men who think they can take what's mine, Bumpy said, his voice steady, but with a cold finality that sent a shiver down everyone's spine. Tony nodded, his face hardening. I'll take care of it. We'll show them they made the wrong move. But Bumpy held up a hand. No, he said, his gaze intense. This time I'm handling it myself. The weight of Bumpy's words hit the room like a drumbeat. Everyone in that room knew that Bumpy didn't back down from anything. And when the king of Harlem said he would handle it himself, that meant there would be no mercy. Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a name on the streets, he was an institution. A legend forged from the flames of Harlem's turbulent underworld. He had risen from nothing to control everything. Born in 1905 in Charleston, South Carolina, Bumpy came from a world of poverty and hardship. He knew early on that if he was going to survive, he would have to learn how to navigate the darkness. The kind of darkness that ran through the streets like blood in the veins of the city. Harlem had become his kingdom. By the 1930s, Bumpy had taken control of the numbers racket, expanded into the drug trade, and dominated the gambling scene. His rise wasn't just about violence or fear. It was about building loyalty, striking deals with the right people, and using his mind to outsmart rivals. He was as intelligent as he was ruthless, and he knew that in a world like Harlem's, power didn't come from just controlling the streets. It came from controlling the people who lived on them. By the late 1940s, Bumpy had formed an alliance with the Mafia, a relationship that had proved lucrative for both parties. But Bumpy was never fully under their thumb. He had his own rules, his own way of running things. In the criminal underworld, that kind of independence made him a force to be reckoned with. But even legends aren't invincible. By 1963, the Mafia had grown restless. Their grip on Harlem was slipping, and their sights were set on a bigger piece of the pie. Bumpy's reign, which had once seemed unshakable, was now threatened by forces that wanted to take what he had built. The Mafia's attempts to infiltrate his territory were no longer subtle. The men who had once been his partners were now his enemies, and Bumpy knew that in the world of crime there was no room for sentiment. You either adapt or you fall. The first sign of trouble came through a well-placed informant, someone who had once worked with Bumpy and had been feeding information to the Mafia. It was a betrayal, and one that would prove costly for both sides. The informant's name was Frank, and Bumpy had trusted him for years. But as Bumpy learned, trust in the streets was often fleeting. Bumpy sat in his office, the room quiet, except for the sound of his fingers drumming on the table. Tony stood beside him, his face etched with concern. "Frank's the one who gave them the information," Tony said, his voice low. "He's the one who sold you out." Bumpy didn't flinch. He had known Frank was a risk, but the betrayal stung nonetheless. Frank had been more than an informant. He had been a confidant, someone who had worked his way up through the ranks under Bumpy's watch. It was one thing to deal with rivals from the outside, but dealing with a traitor in the ranks was something else entirely. It was a challenge that could topple even the most solid empire. "So they think they can use him to take me down?" Bumpy's voice was calm, but the anger simmered just beneath the surface. Tony nodded. "They've got Frank feeding them everything, every deal, every move you make. They're closing in, Bumpy. If we don't do something fast, they're going to make their move." The room fell silent. Bumpy stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. He walked over to the window, his gaze sweeping over Harlem. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him, but he didn't let it show. Bumpy Johnson had never been a man who panicked. In fact, it was the calm before the storm that made him so dangerous. "I'm not going to wait for them to come for me," he said, turning to face Tony. "I'm going to make sure they understand that nobody, not even the Mafia, crosses me." The plan was set in motion as soon as Bumpy spoke. There would be no more waiting, no more hoping the Mafia would back down. Bumpy had learned long ago that in the underworld, weakness wasn't tolerated. The Mafia's encroachment on his territory needed to be stopped, and it needed to be stopped decisively. It was time to make his move, and make it in a way that would send a message not only to the Mafia but to anyone who thought they could challenge his reign. Bumpy called for a meeting with his most trusted men, those who had been with him from the beginning. They gathered in the back room of a local jazz club, the kind of place where the air was thick with smoke, and the music masked the whispering of dangerous deals. As always, the room was dimly lit, casting shadows that made the men appear like ghosts, their faces hard and determined. "Listen up," Bumpy said, his voice steady, yet commanding. "The Mafia thinks they can take what's mine. They think they can push me out. Well, they're wrong. We're not going to wait for them to make their move. We're going to make theirs for them." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room to meet the gaze of each man. He wasn't asking for their approval. He was telling them what was going to happen next. "I've been in this game long enough to know that you don't let them come to you. You go to them and you show them that they've made a deadly mistake. Tonight, we hit them where it hurts. We take their confidence and we crush it." There was no hesitation. Every man in the room understood the gravity of the situation. They knew Bumpy. They knew that when he made a decision, it was final, and there would be no turning back. This wasn't just about taking back control of Harlem. It was about asserting his dominance, about sending a message that anyone who tried to take from him would suffer the consequences. The plan was simple but effective. They would strike at the heart of the Mafia's operations, cut off their supply chains, hit their fronts, and take down key players in one swift blow. Bumpy's men, already embedded in the underworld, knew where the Mafia's weakest points were. The element of surprise would be their greatest weapon. As the night wore on, Bumpy's crew moved into position, each one poised to take their place in the plan. The city was quiet, but underneath the calm, the tension was palpable. The Mafia didn't know what was coming, but Bumpy's men did. They were ready to show the world that Harlem wasn't just a place on the map, it was Bumpy's kingdom. The first blow struck when Bumpy's men took out a key player in the Mafia's drug trade, a man by the name of Tony the Tiger Ferraro. Ferraro had been running one of the Mafia's most profitable operations, and Bumpy had made it clear that Ferraro's days were numbered. The hit was swift and efficient. By the time the Mafia even realized what had happened, their operations were in disarray. Next, Bumpy's men targeted the Mafia's gambling fronts. The Mafia had been making millions off of rigged dice games, poker tables, and underground betting parlors. Bumpy's men took out each operation with military precision, ensuring that none of the Mafia's income streams would be untouched. In the course of a few hours, the Mafia's cash flow had been severed, their main sources of income wiped out. But it wasn't just about the money. The real devastation came when Bumpy's crew moved to take out the Mafia's key leaders, the men who had been pulling the strings behind the scenes. They knew that in order to truly break the Mafia's hold on Harlem, they needed to eliminate the power structure at its core. These were men who had long held sway over the city, men who had made deals with politicians and businessmen, men who had thought themselves untouchable. And yet, Bumpy had made them all touchable. The final confrontation came when Bumpy himself faced off with Don Salvatore Big Sal Giordano, the head of the Mafia's operations in Harlem. Giordano had been the mastermind behind the push into Bumpy's territory, the man who had orchestrated the move to usurp Bumpy's rule. Bumpy met Giordano in a warehouse on the edge of the city, the place where the Mafia stored their weapons and illicit goods. The tension between the two men was palpable, the air thick with the weight of years of rivalry and resentment. "You should have known better, Sal," Bumpy said, his voice low but filled with authority. "You don't mess with me. You don't mess with Harlem." Giordano, ever the calm and calculated figure, didn't flinch. "I thought you'd understand, Bumpy," he said, his tone cold. "It was never personal. This is business. You were always going to fall sooner or later." Bumpy's eyes narrowed. "Well, tonight's the night I prove you wrong." In that moment, everything that had been building, every threat, every whispered promise of revenge, all of it came crashing down. Bumpy's men moved quickly, surrounding Giordano's crew, taking out anyone who posed a threat. The gunshots rang out like thunder in the empty warehouse, each shot a message, each bullet a testament to Bumpy's resolve. Giordano tried to make a run for it, but Bumpy was faster. With one swift move, he cut off the Don's escape route. And in the silence that followed the chaos, Bumpy stood over the fallen man, his breathing steady, his victory clear. "You should have stayed in your lane," Bumpy muttered, his voice cold as ice. In the aftermath of the attack, the Mafia's stronghold in Harlem had crumbled. Bumpy's message had been clear. Harlem was his, and anyone who tried to take it from him would pay the price. The Mafia's loss was felt across the city. Their men were either dead or scattered, their operations in shambles. But it wasn't just the Mafia who felt the consequences. The streets of Harlem buzzed with talk of Bumpy's victory. He had not only defeated the Mafia, but had done so in a way that had shaken the very foundation of organized crime. The power structure that had been in place for so long was no more. The people of Harlem saw Bumpy as more than just a criminal. He was a man who had fought for his city and come out victorious. Politicians, law enforcement, and rival gangs all took notice. Bumpy Johnson was no longer just the king of Harlem. He had become a symbol of power, a man who had taken control not just of the streets, but of his own destiny. The Mafia's fall wasn't just a victory for Bumpy. It was a victory for the people of Harlem, who had long been overlooked, taken for granted, and treated as if their lives didn't matter. The aftermath of Bumpy Johnson's victory was a turning point not only for Harlem, but for the entire criminal underworld. The Mafia, once a looming force in the city, was now fractured, its grip on Harlem shattered. The old guard, the men who had thought themselves untouchable, had fallen. And in their place, Bumpy Johnson stood tall, a king without a rival in his own territory. Bumpy had always known that power was not just about control, it was about respect. And now, as the dust settled, the respect Bumpy had built over decades became undeniable. Harlem, which had once been a battleground of gang wars and crime, now seemed to breathe easier. The Mafia's loss was the people's gain. As the weeks passed, Bumpy's reputation only grew. News of the destruction of the Mafia spread like wildfire, and his name became synonymous with invincibility. People from all walks of life, businessmen, politicians, even the police, understood that crossing Bumpy Johnson was no longer an option. The day he took down the Mafia, He didn't just secure his hold on Harlem, he had cemented his place in history as one of the most dangerous, strategic, and powerful men to ever walk the streets of New York. But Bumpy was no fool. He knew the delicate balance of power in the underworld, and even though he had eliminated the Mafia's influence in Harlem, he wasn't about to rest on his laurels. He had built his empire, but empires were never built to last without constant vigilance. He knew that there were always new players, new challenges, and new threats waiting in the wings. And as the Mafia crumbled, other rivals would soon try to fill the void. Still, Bumpy's victory was a moment that would echo for years to come. The streets of Harlem, for all their danger and violence, had never seen a figure like Bumpy. He had taken control with precision, not with brute force alone, but with calculated moves and an unyielding will to survive. His legacy would be one of strength, intelligence, and fearlessness, a man who could command respect from both the criminal underworld and the powerful elite. The respect Bumpy earned wasn't just for what he had done, it was for how he did it. He had fought for Harlem in a way that no one had ever done before. He had taken back control of his territory and made sure that the world knew who ruled it. And with that, his legend was solidified in the hearts and minds of the people who had witnessed his rise. The fall of the Mafia in 1963 was a monumental moment, not just for Bumpy Johnson but for Harlem itself. It was a reminder that power wasn't just something that was handed down, it was something you fought for, something you earned. And Bumpy Johnson had earned his place in history, not by bowing to anyone, but by making sure that no one ever dared to challenge him again. For the people of Harlem, Bumpy's victory was more than just a personal triumph. It was a message that even in a world where power was often dictated by corruption, loyalty, and violence, there was always room for a man who refused to back down. Bumpy Johnson was more than a criminal. He was a symbol of defiance, of survival, and of the unbreakable spirit of the people who lived in the shadows. This wasn't just about one man's pride. It was about the pride of an entire community, a community that had been overlooked, disrespected, and marginalized for far too long. And sometimes it takes a legend to remind the world what respect really means. Bumpy Johnson didn't just destroy the Mafia, he built something far more powerful. He built a legacy that would live on long after the streets had quieted, a legacy that would be remembered as the day Harlem's king ruled not with fear, but with the kind of respect that comes only from true power. Bumpy Johnson's destruction of the Mafia in 1963 wasn't just a turning point in his personal saga, it was a defining moment in the history of Harlem. The day he wiped out the Mafia's hold on his turf, Bumpy proved that loyalty and respect weren't just words to be spoken, they were the pillars of his empire. Harlem had always been a battleground of power, but on that day, Bumpy Johnson showed the world who truly ruled. His actions that day reverberated far beyond the streets of Harlem. To the people, Bumpy was no longer just a man. He had become a symbol of resilience, a living testament to the strength that could come from the struggle to survive. In a world where the underworld often operated in the shadows, Bumpy had stepped into the light, unapologetically claiming his place in history. And yet, what made Bumpy's victory even more powerful was the fact that it wasn't about the wealth, the control, or the power. Those were just the byproducts. What truly mattered to Bumpy was the recognition, the respect that had been earned through years of blood, sweat, and an unwavering commitment to his people. He didn't just want to be feared, he wanted to be respected, to be seen as a man who had fought for his place at the table and had the strength to keep it. The Mafia's downfall was inevitable. It wasn't because Bumpy had more muscle, but because he had more heart, more intellect, and more understanding of the streets. They underestimated him. They thought they could push him around, take what was his, and walk away unscathed. But Bumpy had made a lifetime of making the impossible look easy. When they tried to take Harlem, he reminded them of one simple truth. Harlem wasn't theirs to take. In the end, Bumpy Johnson didn't just destroy an empire, he forged a legacy that would live on in the stories told in the backrooms of Harlem, in the whispers of respect passed from one generation to the next. Bumpy didn't need the Mafia, Hollywood, or the politicians to define him. He defined himself, and that was the ultimate power. This wasn't just about one man's fight. It was about a community's pride, dignity, and will to survive. In the face of betrayal, in the face of overwhelming odds, Bumpy Johnson had shown that it wasn't the size of the fight in the man that mattered, it was the size of the man's heart. And that was something no one could ever take away. The streets of Harlem, the world of crime, and the corridors of power would never forget the name Bumpy Johnson. His legend wasn't just built on what he controlled, but on the respect he commanded from those who crossed his path. And that respect, the kind that only a true king could command, would echo through the streets of Harlem long after his name had been spoken for the last time. In the end, Bumpy's story wasn't just about power. It was about resilience, survival, and the kind of legacy that can't be erased. And sometimes it takes a legend to remind the world what respect really means.